The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We covered the story of Oscar Groening. I'm not exactly sure how his last name is pronounced. I think it's Groening.
It's Groening, yeah.
He is the former Nazi SS guard who has been called colloquially, as if we need colloquial names for Nazis, the Bookkeeper of Auschwitz. And he successfully avoided a prosecution and justice for most of his life. He was eventually found and faced trial more than 70 years after the conflict. He was found guilty of being an accessory to murder, and he was sentenced, and he has died without serving any of that sentence at age 96. I actually think that this furthers my belief, further ingrains my view that we should be totally agnostic to the age of the accused in terms of deciding whether or not to prosecute. And my position for a long time has been, listen, if someone has evaded justice for their whole life, you don't reward them by saying, hey, we're not going to prosecute you, unless there's a statute of limitations issue, which of course there is not on Nazi war crimes. You prosecute them because they've actually had a much better life than arguably they should have or would have had they been prosecuted appropriately earlier on in their lives. And then you can consider advanced age or physical condition, medical problems, in sentencing, but you've still got to prosecute. You can never send the signal that if you avoid prosecution long enough, we're going to let you off the hook. And you know what? The guy's 96. He died. He's not going to serve his sentence. Can't do anything about that. But the right thing is to prosecute him. If you believe that he is guilty of the crimes for which he was accused. He was found guilty, and I stand totally behind my perspective on this.
Yeah, I think the reality, though, is even if he did enter prison, his living conditions wouldn't be too much different because the man was 96 years old. I don't think he was in the best health. No. And I think he would have been imprisoned in Europe, too, and they tend to be a little bit more liberal when it comes to the criminal justice system over there.
Agreed.
Obviously, you're not gonna rehabilitate this guy. He's too old, and I think he is somewhat at least remorseful, at least ostensibly, about what he did. Yeah. But yeah, I don't think his final days would have been too different.
They may not have been, and I think that we shouldn't be influenced by that. That's the key thing. Even if his days would not have been different, every aspect of the message that is sent when you say it doesn't matter how long you escape us, doesn't matter how old you are, and it doesn't matter ultimately if you die, everybody who can be tied to these horrific crimes is going to be prosecuted, and they are going to be, on paper, found guilty if indeed there is evidence for that. And the historical record will be that everybody that we found, we prosecuted. Yeah. And I think that there is value to that.
Well, regrettably, very few of the SS guards at Auschwitz were ever prosecuted.
Yep.
Of the 6,500 guards that were captured after the war, fewer than 50 were ever convicted. That's a bad rate.
It's not a bad rate. And arguably that makes it even more important to say that when you find one, you prosecute them. I think we would say him, right? They were exclusively men, I believe.
Yeah, I would imagine. Yeah.
Hard to imagine Hitler having female SS guards, but I don't. I guess that's a detail I don't actually know much about.
If only the Allied forces were more strict on this sort of thing after the war. I think they were just focusing on the leaders of the Nazi movement rather than individuals, because probably after all that wartime, they wanted to move on in some respect.
I don't know. I mean, I think this is more of an issue of limited resources. I think
that's true.
There's no real evidence it was about moving on because 70 years later and we're still prosecuting people. I think if we wanted to move on, we would sort of say, hey, listen, it's been 70 years. But yeah, a lot of the lower level people and even sort of like medium to high level people notably escaping to some countries in South America where there were lesser immigration controls and just a horrible, what can we say? We can't really say much else about it other than I stand by the prosecution of anybody that we find and have evidence was involved in these horrible crimes.
I mean, even though he got to live out his full life as a free man, you have to hope that he was, kicking himself and upset with himself
tortured
for the duration of his life. Yeah, tortured.
You would hope so.
And that it would only happen if he was, in fact, remorseful for what he did.
Yep.
I'd have to imagine with all that time to self-rehabilitate, he probably did get to a good place with it.
I don't know. I mean, the other side of it would be that instead of being remorseful and self-rehabilitating during those 70 years,
yeah,
it could be 70 years of anxiety, sort of like when you are exiled from Russia, but someday they're going to poison you type of thing.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that fades after 30 of the 70 years. It's so hard to really imagine what it would be like.
And one may think that if he did feel that regret and that remorse, he would turn himself in.
Arguably.
Although
maybe he says, listen, I've sorted it out on my own, and the jail time is no longer necessary anymore. Interesting declaration or acknowledgement from National Geographic earlier this week that for a time they were covering the world through a racist lens. And this includes portrayals of bare-breasted women, the naive tribesmen portrayed as savages and unsophisticated and unintelligent. And the editor-in-chief of National Geographic, Susan Goldberg, which, by the way, National Geographic now owned by News Corporation, which is the same parent company of Fox News, Susan Goldberg saying, we had to own our story to move beyond it. And that they've published an article about this, and they are saying, we were part of the problem for some time. The magazine first published in 1888. And there was a long period between 88 and 2018 during which views were not hugely enlightened on some of the less technologically advanced populations of the world. And yeah, I mean, it's sort of like it's not an analogy, but it's another example of, I think that in the future, when we see the program Cops, we will sort of see it as a pretty depraved and incredibly racially tinged pseudo nonfiction portrayal of crime in America, or whatever you want to call it. I think that this is sort of a similar thing, where now we're realizing that the way in which these tribes have often been portrayed has been as less than full people in some way.
Yeah.
And I think it's good that National Geographic is sort of offering a mea culpa on this.
Yeah, I like the apology. I think it kind of goes without saying that their coverage would be a little bit racist, or a lot racist, because they started in 1888,
right?
And our society at large was racist, so you'd have
Certainly.
to imagine that the magazine was reflective of that.
Yeah.
And so maybe some people would find it a little bit odd that they were apologizing for things that happened over a century ago.
Right.
But governments apologize for things that they committed in the past, like atrocities, whether it be here in America, Trail of Tears, or slavery, or Jim Crow.
Yeah, even though they said that they were still doing this stuff as recently as the 70s, 80s, and even 90s.
Oh, man,
so it's actually not been, it was 140 or 130 years ago, and also much, much more recently than that. I don't read National Geographic. My mom used to get it, and when News Corp bought it, she said, that's it for me.
Huh, I didn't even know that. So Rupert Murdoch's pulling the strings there now?
Well, I mean, I don't know how directly involved he is, but a couple of years ago, I think it was, that News Corporation took it over. Sticking sort of with the topic of race, Bruno Mars, who is Hawaiian, I believe. Bruno Mars, native Hawaiian or something like that?
In ancestry, he is half Filipino.
Okay.
And he's half Puerto Rican Jewish.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, half Puerto Rican Jewish, half Filipino Bruno Mars is the target of some criticism for cultural appropriation, because activists have accused him of profiting from traditionally black music. Of course, cultural appropriation defined as the act of taking or using things from a culture that's not your own, especially without showing that you understand or respect the culture. And I just don't even know that it's accurate. I mean, number one, I think it's sort of a ridiculous allegation, but I also don't know that it's accurate, because his music is really a blend of genres. And yeah, I mean, I guess that, reggae has black roots, although they're not really African-American roots. You think of Jamaica and, Afro-Cuban, Afro-Caribbean, soul music, funk, R&B, hip-hop. I don't know, but the real problem that I have with it is that where are all the people saying that Eric Clapton needs to apologize for appropriating black music? Because Eric Clapton has become what would we call it, a centimillionaire worth several hundred millions of dollars on the basis of playing blues almost exclusively for his entire life. And you know what? There probably are people who say that he's guilty of cultural appropriation for profit, but it's not even really, it's just, nobody's really upset about that right now anyway. So it's a huge double standard.
And I think Eric Clapton ripped off Jimi Hendrix. One could say that.
Maybe so, but that's sort of a different story. And so, yes, Saren Sensei is an activist who, in a clip for The Grapevine, which is a web series that promotes African-American issues, said Bruno Mars is 100% a cultural appropriator. He's not black at all, and he plays up racial ambiguity to cross genres. So maybe that's the difference, where nobody could accuse Eric Clapton of being racially ambiguous and playing that up in order to play blues, that he's just a white British dude, and that's what he does. Whereas Bruno Mars could be perceived as maybe black. Yeah. But I think that that's also an insane criticism, because what you're basically saying is people should have to announce their race. Like Bruno Mars, in order to not be seen as possibly playing up racial ambiguity, should announce, before you hear my music, I should let you know I'm not actually black. I'm half Filipino, Jewish, and Puerto Rican, or whatever.
It's like there aren't many half Filipino, half Puerto Rican, Jewish people out there, let alone artists. So you're saying that those are the only group of that's the only group of people that he can copy when it comes to his music and his artistry?
The only music Bruno Mars should be playing is a Puerto Rican klezmer hybrid that would incorporate the most popular styles of the Jewish community and of the Puerto Rican community. Or something. I mean, it's so stupid. And I think that, what are we going to gain from this? What is the objective of this? What could we possibly hope to achieve as an outcome by saying Bruno Mars is doing the wrong thing because of the type of music that he's playing? I just have a real hard time with it.
Even when the African-American artists, many of them are saying that they don't believe that they're ripping him off.
The African-American artists don't believe that they're ripping off Bruno Mars.
So he's accused of ripping off a few African-American artists.
Oh.
But many of those people, even if they're in their 60s or 70s or whatever, they're saying that it's not cultural appropriation. He's just bringing a new twist to it.
The African-American artists are saying that Bruno Mars isn't ripping them
They're
off.
giving a pass, yeah.
They're giving him, okay. Well, hey, listen, I mean, it's their opinion. My question is, what do you hope to get out of this? What do you hope to get out of this? And is this the forefront of race relations right now? And we've talked about this before, when there have been sort of more mundane accusations of cultural appropriation, when I guess what I would call a seemingly white person styles their hair in dreadlocks. And there's actually a famous video from, I don't know if it's UC Berkeley or some California university, where a seemingly white guy with dreads was sort of bullied and attacked because of so-called cultural appropriation. And I recognize that we have race issues in the United States of America. I don't think the solution is berating white dudes with dreads and Bruno Mars for playing a mix of music that comes from styles that are historically African-American. I just don't think that's the path forward.
Wasn't there one instance of cultural appropriation you were willing to hear out, which was the bodegas in New York City? There was a company trying to use that name. I think it was Bodega.
Yeah, I mean, that seemed
more... And those
are
typically associated with immigrants working in those little shops.
So in New York, the bodega typically is the often immigrant-run little store that often is a combination grocery, deli, convenience type store. And a company that was either doing, I think it was like a vending machine for high-end juices or high-end snacks.
It was a glorified vending machine.
It was a glorified vending machine. That was different. I don't think the problem is cultural appropriation. I think the problem is sort of a deceptive business practice, because it's taking advantage of a particular brand that is sort of disproportionately connected to the immigrant experience of New York City. So I just found it sort of more deceptive and predatory than really it being a question of cultural appropriation, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
That would be the difference, I guess, that I would point out there. Send me your thoughts. Am I missing something? Am I being insensitive to the cultural appropriation misdeeds of Bruno Mars? Let me know if you think that's the case.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.